Hi Fiber Friend, I'm Jess and this is Adventures in Knitting. I'm pivoting a little this week because I got a very strong response to my announcement last week that I'm knitting the Antipodes sweater. I got comments here on the channel, on my Instagram, and in a knitting group I belong to, and the same message kept coming across all channels, and that was a lot of knitters are feeling apprehension about starting this project. I have cast on, and in classic Jess fashion, I have overthought this entire project. So I am going to share some of my thoughts with you and experience with you on casting on the Antipodes in the event that it may help you in how you approach this project and maybe help reduce some of the apprehension you may be feeling, because this is a big project. It is a complex construction. There are a lot of pieces to manage and a lot of things to keep track of. So I'm going to cover 3 topics in this video: the construction of the sweater, yarn choice, because that will affect how you approach this project, and also tips for casting on. First, let's talk about construction. I'm going to insert some photos here so you can see exactly the area of the sweater that I'm talking about. I want to talk about this sweater in terms of a finished object. This pattern is incredibly dense. So I think if you're just going into it and just starting to read the pattern, you're going to get quickly overwhelmed because there is a lot. This is a size inclusive pattern. So you're also looking through lots of lines of text to find the measurements that you're looking for your size. And that can be a lot. So I want to take a step back and look at the sweater as a finished object so you can start to understand how the pieces come together. This is a cropped sweater with a slightly dropped hem in the back, and it is knit using a saddle shoulder construction from the top down. So you are starting casting on with the saddle shoulder, which is this part right here. It's this part of your body. And that saddle shoulder is going to cup this part of your shoulder. And then from the front, you will pick up the front yoke, and from the back, you will pick up the back yoke. So that first part that you're casting on is actually knit flat. And you're shaping not only your shoulder increases for the saddle shoulder, but also the shape of the neck. And then the rest of the sweater comes down from there. Couple of things that pop out to me right away about this construction. It's a cropped sweater. It has a dropped hem in the back. It does have the saddle shoulder, so the shoulder is going to come down the arm. And from there, you will pick up for the sleeves. So what this means is a couple of things for me specifically that I'm looking at when I'm approaching the construction of this sweater. I have a large bust. I am knitting this sweater knowing I'm going to be shrinking. These are 2 challenges that I'm immediately facing. So let's talk about knitting this sweater if you have a large bust. I do want to point out that Andrea Mowry has posted several videos on her own channel, and I will link below. She gives great tips for doing some of these things, and I've had a long think about them and what I'm likely going to do in this construction. And the reason I mentioned that I'm shrinking is I'm slightly worried that at the start of knitting this sweater, it's not going to fit. So I'm not sure if I can try it on as I'm knitting it. We'll see. I've never knit a sweater before, so we're going to figure this out as we go along. But as far as accommodating your size, I have a large bust. If you look at the front of the construction of this sweater, once you're past the yoke, you're going to start knitting in the round with all that color work right there. There is a space above the color work and a space below the color work where you can add short rows. And that short rows will help give you some shaping. I know you can add bust darts, but my concern is putting in bust darts where the color work is. I don't really want to mess with the color work, and I'm not looking for a slim fitting, tight fit to the sweater. It's okay that it's a little loose. It's okay that I want a more boxy feel, and I'm going to get into that later about why I want a more boxy feel. But I do want a little bit more length to accommodate the bust without losing the drop hem in the back. I do really like the drop hem in the back. So what I'm thinking is you could add rows in both places and add length to the front maybe centering that color work. My worry with that is, as a large busted woman, and if you have a large bosom, you've probably thought of about this, I try really hard not to draw attention to it. This is going to come up a lot. There are tricks you can do to make your bust look smaller. So what I don't want to do is to put more short rows on the top that will move the color work down so that it starts like on the nipple line. We want to avoid that. So I think I'm just going to add the short rows in the bottom. But I'm going to try it on. I mentioned in the last video, this is a really bad idea, but I'm doing it anyway. But I'm going to try it on as I'm knitting it to see where that color work is going to start, and if I can put short rows up here or if I'm going to save them for the bottom. But also I do want to preserve that drop hem. Now that we've talked a little bit about the construction, I also want to mention that all of these pieces, you're starting with the saddle shoulder, you're picking up the back yoke, the front yoke, you'll pick up the sleeves at the end, you knit in the round once you have that front and back yoke going. There's a lot to keep track of because you're mirroring sides. So your right shoulder needs to match your left shoulder. You're knitting the right shoulder first, you're gonna then connect through the back and knit the left shoulder. There's a lot to keep track of. So what I would recommend is, yes, read through your pattern in its entirety. Read through the pattern in its entirety. But once you've read through the pattern, sit down with yourself and do what I'm doing here. Say to yourself, do I understand this construction and can I repeat it without looking at the pattern? One of the things that I learned from a really great professor in college was write your paper. Use all your sources, cite all your sources, figure all your things out, write it all down. Write it again. Write it again, not using your sources, and see if you can do it. Because that will tell you if you've actually learned what you've read or if you're just going off of your notes. So yes, read through your pattern. Yes, take notes, figure out your size, highlight. You can go through and highlight your size for everything so you can see it right away. But what's important to do is to ask yourself, do you really understand the construction? Do you realize that when you cast on at the very beginning, that right shoulder, that you'll have to keep track of all those increases because you'll have to mirror them on the other side? Do you understand that you're picking up the back yoke from the back of the saddle shoulder and you're picking up the front yoke from the front of the saddle shoulder, and that you're doing your shaping in those yokes? Do you understand all of those pieces together? Because once you know how you're thinking about the construction of it, you can then set up a system for yourself to manage the project. I think there is a tendency to read through knitting patterns in a linear fashion. I come from a background of project management, so I am always looking ahead as to what are going to be the pitfalls. What are the things that are going to hang up the project? So instead of thinking about a project in a linear fashion, I am thinking of it as moving parts all at the same time. So when I go to set up a system for managing that project, I want a system that's going to be flexible to accommodate all those moving parts. So for you, this might be a paper pattern. You may download the pattern, print it off, take all of your notes on it, and you may use sticky notes to put things in there and say, hey, when you're doing this right shoulder increase, keep track of the rows in between the increases, how many you did, how many rows you did on the even section so that you can mirror it on the other side. Whatever that system is that works for you. I am using an app. I am using my row counter, and I will insert some footage here so you can see what I'm talking about. You can put in several different row counters in this app per project. And what I'm doing is I'm creating one for every single thing that I have to keep track of in order to mirror from right to left. This is very helpful. I did a bunch of free trials on knitting pattern apps because I have always been a paper girl, But when I realized how many rows I would have to keep track of, I knew I needed more than just my little coconuts clicky counter, row counter thing. I knew I needed something more. So I did a bunch of free trials. I found this app that I liked the best. And so that's what I'm using to manage this project. And I'm doing all of those little row counters to keep track of everything that you need to keep track of in this saddle shoulder alone. So that is the construction of the sweater. And again, I really, really strongly suggest that you sit with the pattern for a while and start to understand how it's going to work for you. Picture it on your body. If instead of thinking of it in terms of knits and purls and rows and stitches and binding off and holding stitches to pick up the sleeves, think of it as a finished object first. Break it down into all the parts from there and how it's going to be worn on your body, and then ask yourself, how are you going to manage this project? And I've heard this from a lot of knitters who are approaching this project, that they're fine when they're knitting the piece itself and they're working on just the tiny little part of the pattern that they're working on. But then when you start to think of it as the full sweater, it starts to get a little daunting and it's overwhelming. And so I definitely suggest breaking it down into those pieces, thinking of it in terms of it being on your body. That's really important. Then it becomes not just this pattern on a page, but it becomes something that you're making for yourself. So now I'm going to talk about yarn choices. This is really important when you're knitting color work, but also I know the yarn that Andrea used to knit her samples sold out really, really fast. So I know people are scrambling to find subs. So I wanted to share the yarn that I'm going to be using, but also a little bit more about the yarn to help you decide what kind of yarn you might want to use as a substitute. Maybe you did get the yarn that Andrea used and you were lucky enough to actually get it before it sold out. But I'm hoping this will help you pick out a yarn that will make this project a success for you. So my design for this, my aesthetic, when I first saw this pattern come up, I knew immediately that I had the yarn in my stash for the color work. I just needed a main color. And it was really the sound wave color work on this sweater that drew me to it, because I will be honest with you, I don't like a drop shoulder and I don't like a saddle shoulder. As I mentioned before, I have a large bust, and so I do a lot of things in what I'm wearing to minimize that large bust. A drop shoulder is really bad when you have a large bust, because what happens is that shoulder hem will fall right in the largest part of your bust. So that's something that I'm going to be paying attention to. But I saw those sound waves, and I've had this yarn in my stash for a really long time, and I said, okay, I can work with this. I can minimize the effect of the saddle shoulder and make this work for my body. Because that's the beautiful thing about knitting, is you can make this pattern yours. So this is what I'm using for yarn. For my main color, I showed you this last week. This is the Scottish Wool Company. This is their 4-ply fingering weight in the color Gordon. I have started knitting with this, and it is an absolute dream. It is everything I have ever wanted in a Scottish woolly wool yarn. This was formerly called the Scottish Yarn Festival. You may have heard that name. It was founded by Eva Christie. They're going through a rebrand right now and becoming the Scottish Wool Company. This is Scottish grown wool milled in Yorkshire. It is 80% Shetland, 20% Cheviot. It is non-superwash. That is important to remember. This is a non-superwashed wool. For my contrasting color, I am using Night Bloom. This is a Spin Cycle dyed in the wool exclusive colorway for Port Fiber, the yarn store in Portland, Maine. If you're not familiar with this, Spin Cycle does a lot of custom colorways for yarn stores in their dyed in the wool weight, which is their sport weight. So be sure to be on the lookout if you're visiting local yarn stores. Some yarn stores have amazing exclusive colorways. Port Fiber has a great one. This is Night Bloom. I'll insert a photo here of what it looks like knit up because it is electric. I absolutely love this colorway. Another local yarn store that has a great exclusive colorway and dyed in the wool is Verb. You've probably heard of Verb in California. They have a beautiful exclusive colorway in Dyed in the Wool. So Dyed in the Wool is a sport weight yarn. It is super washed. That's important to know. Why did I choose these colors? I was going for an 80s aesthetic in my sweater. I wanted, remember I said I wanted a boxy look with a marled background and bold electric colorwork. This is my electric colorwork. This is my attempt at a marled background. I will go into more detail on my swatch later and why I chose these two yarns and how they work together. But first I want to talk about superwash versus non-superwash. If you are new to colorwork, as I am, you may be surprised, maybe not, to hear that using different types of yarn are going to affect the tension in your colorwork. So let's talk about wool, right? We're a knitting podcast. Let's talk about wool. Wool, the actual fiber of wool, contains all of these little protein tips along the strand. Those little protein tips act as scales. And so what happens when you knit with it is that wool wants to cling to the other wool. Those little protein tips want to mesh together and hook onto each other. So if you're doing color work with a bunch of non-superwashed wool, all of those little scales will start to cling together. And so when you block something with wool, especially the non-superwash wool, wool is hygroscopic. So it's going to absorb all that moisture. Those protein tips are going to lift up because they're absorbing that moisture. And then as that moisture dries, they're going to start to really lock together. And that's when you're going to get almost like a halo effect in your color work. It will look like an oil painting or a pastel painting. But what happens when you use superwashed wool? The superwash process can either remove those protein tips or smooth them out. So what does that mean practically? When you're knitting color work, that superwash yarn can be very slippery. If you're new to color work, you may find working with the superwash yarn difficult. I'm going to tell you, it was a nightmare to do the swatch for this sweater because I had never done color work before. And I knew that I wanted to use this yarn. It is superwash. It's very slippery and you can feel it. When you compare these two, a superwash and a non-superwash, you can feel the difference in the fiber. So when knitting them together, I really had to pay attention to my tension because you don't want to lose the tension in the color work and make it all loose. And that may be a problem if you're using superwash and are not familiar with color work. If you're like me, this is your first sweater, it's your first time doing color work, you may want to choose non-superwash wools. Just a suggestion, maybe you are a champ at managing your tension and you will be fine with superwash. Just something to think about when you're thinking about yarn choices. Now that we've gone over the construction of the sweater and yarn choices, I want to switch to the overhead camera to give you a closer view of my swatch and some of the things that I'm looking for when I'm knitting up this yarn for the sweater. And I also am going to give you a closer look at the saddle shoulder, which I have already cast on because I have quite a few tips to help you cast on the Antipodes sweater. So let's switch to the other camera. So here is my swatch that I knit for the Antipodes sweater. I actually got gauge like immediately. And I knit this swatch in the round. You can see I cut all my pieces. This is my very first attempt at color work ever, and I am impressed with how it turned out. You will note I made a lot of mistakes, and you can see them in the swatch. So it was good practice. I definitely know what to do next time, but the things that I want to talk about on this swatch are a couple of different things that really stand out to me, the difference between the superwash and non-superwash wool. You can see here the incredible stitch definition in the superwash wool, and you can see how the non-superwash has a little bit more of a halo. And this is giving me exactly the 80s vibes that I was looking for. So it came out absolutely how I wanted it to. When you're swatching for the Antipodes, there are large sections of the sweater that are knit flat. So if you know that your tension differs wildly between knitting in the round and knitting flat, you may want to consider doing 2 swatches, doing one in the round and doing one flat, just to see where you're going to end up. That is the swatch. Let's now talk about the saddle shoulder. This is the saddle shoulder. This is the first part you're going to knit when you cast on the Antipodes. You're starting at this point here with a provisional cast on. You are knitting flat in stockinette in these alternating rows between your main color and your contrasting color. A couple of things I want to talk about. This provisional cast on. I had never done a provisional cast on before, so this was new to me. I will link the video down below that Andrea Mowry has posted on how to do this. It's perfect. It's an excellent video. I can't do it better, so I'm not going to replicate it. The one thing I do want to mention, if you've never done a provisional cast on like this, when you're doing it, you are casting on stitches not only on this cord, but on a needle as well. And you're holding them together like this. And you're wrapping your yarn around both the needle and the cord. When I did this, I was very worried about tension, because when you're casting on, you want to be careful about how tight your stitches are, so that when you go to knit that first row, you're able to get your needle under the stitch knitwise. So when I was casting on in this provisional cast on, I was very worried about that tension. So worried, in fact, that I did it probably 5 or 6 times because I felt my tension was just too tight. Turns out that didn't matter at all. So I want to point that out in case you're in the same boat as me. You're going to be casting on this way. You then turn your work, and you will notice now right away what's going to happen. You are actually purling your first row. That's in the pattern. You can see it. You're purling that first row. So what happens is your stitches, because of how they're cast onto this cord, between the cord and this needle, when you come to purl that first row and you're bringing your needle into the stitch this way to purl, what happens is this needle and this cord naturally separate. So you're opening up those stitches as you're purling along. It doesn't really matter how tight it is in regards to getting the needle in. Yes, you want them nice and neat. You want a consistent tension there, but you don't have to worry so much about being able to get the needle in, because the needle and the cord will separate as you're purling and you'll be able to get in just fine. That was something that would have been helpful to know the first 3 times I cast on, but now you know. I hope that helps. The other thing I want to mention is this is the first time I'm holding stitches, and I'm using a ChowGoo interchangeable cord. This is just an extra cord from my needle set with the stitch stoppers on the end. I hate this. I hate it so much. I have pearl strings coming to replace this. My strands of yarn get caught on these stoppers all the time, and I know you can swap these out. You can also use waste yarn if you want to do that, piece of scrap yarn. But the biggest problem that I'm having with this is there's a wire in here, and this wire sticks to anything magnetic. So my iPad case that I use with my row counter app sticks to this. My project board, my Cocoa Knits project board, has magnets on it. This sticks to that project board. I'm constantly having to free it in order to knit. So that's the part about this that's really bothering me. Something to think about if you've never used an extra cord to do a provisional cast on. I'm glad I know that now. I will not use this again because it's very frustrating that it sticks to everything. Right away, you want to note your right side. So I put a stitch marker in to note right side from wrong side. In the pattern, there are specific instructions about finishing on a wrong side row, starting on a right side row. So you definitely want to know which is right and wrong. It's pretty easy when you're doing stockinette. You can tell which is your right side and which is the wrong side, but I like having that in there anyway. This is that part that's going to go over your shoulder, and you cast on the front yoke from here and the back yoke from here. And you will see you increase just along one edge. And this is something that I picked up a while ago, is putting a stitch marker into all of my increases. I don't trust my memory. So I put a stitch marker there to know every increase, because I don't want to have to remember. I don't want to have to count rows and guess back to where the increase was. And these are all things, all the rows I'm keeping track of in my row counter that I showed you before. And the other two pieces that I am noting is anytime I have to measure something, I am going to put a stitch marker in. So you can see here, I've now gotten to the part where I'm shaping the neck. This is where you bind off to shape the neck. You then have to measure the back neck. So I put a stitch marker in. I'm not guessing. I'm going to put that stitch marker in, and that's it. Then I know exactly where I am and how far I have to go. I like to take out as much guesswork as possible, as much fiddling as possible. I'm not a fan. I don't rely on my memory. My memory is not good. My memory is being used for other things. So I'm not going to rely on that. I am almost ready to start the decreases on the left shoulder. So I'm going to use all of the information, all the notes I took for the right, to make sure that the left mirrors that. You will see here, and this is really, I think, important to note, is you're not only doing color work with your contrasting color like this, but you're also doing large sections with stripes like this. The reason I'm mentioning that is you may like your contrasting color and how it works up like this, but you may not like it like this. These stripes are saying to me, where's Waldo? Like, if you choose the wrong color, this could end very poorly for you. So I think the focus is on this color work because it's right smack in the front of the sweater. So you might not be thinking about these long sections of stockinette rows. It creates a completely different visual pattern. So think about that when you're picking out your contrasting yarn, because you don't want to end up looking like Where's Waldo. For me, I love how it turned out. It's fantastic. One other thing I want to talk about this saddle shoulder is this end is where you're going to pick up the sleeve. And the first part of the sleeve, remember, it's a drop shoulder, so you're already in the widest part of your arm. And then that first section of the arm is more of this stockinette rows. I have a large bust. I'm already concerned about that drop shoulder seam ending right at the largest part of my bust and making the bust look even bigger than it is. What I'm going to attempt in this section of rows is to put my contrasting yarn together at a place where it's low contrast. And what do I mean by that? So here you will see how distinct these stripes are, because this is a really bold electric contrasting color and it draws your attention immediately to it. But if I use a color that is much closer to my main color, it's not going to draw the eye as distinctly. I don't know if this will work. I've never knit a sweater before. I'm winging this, but this is my intention, is to, if I have to, I'll just separate this yarn out and use it when I get to the sleeves. One last thing to note on the saddle shoulder, I saw somebody do this on Instagram. When they finished this saddle shoulder, they steam blocked it, because you're picking up your stitches in these parts that are curling. So they steam blocked it to make sure that that didn't curl. And I think that's such a great idea. And especially, this will be my first time picking up stitches. I want to take out as much of the barriers as possible and make it as easy for me as possible to pick up those stitches. I truly hope you found this video helpful and that it helps to reduce your apprehension about casting on the Antipodes by seeing where you're going to start and all of the different pieces that you'll be working on for the sweater instead of thinking about the entire complex project all at one time. So if you did find this video helpful, I really would appreciate it if you would subscribe. And also, if you're knitting the Antipodes sweater, let me know in the comments below. Let's knit it together. Let's tackle this beast of a project together, because remember, I think your greatest enemy is thinking you're alone in something. We have a lot of exciting things coming up on this channel. Most importantly, I'm going to be getting into fall decorations. I set myself a challenge to knit some new fall decorations this year and to maybe do some needle felting. So if that interests you, please consider subscribing. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you for the next adventure.